chosen one. Right now, somewhere in this world, there's a person sitting in their car after another crushing day, wondering how an entire community turned against them. They're replaying conversations in their mind, searching for the moment everything went wrong. What they don't know is that nothing went wrong at all. Everything went exactly as the universe planned it. Because when the whole damn town works together against little old you and they still lose, that's not coincidence. That's cosmic justice revealing itself through the most embarrassing defeat in human history. Psychological studies reveal that when large groups coordinate against a single individual, the target either breaks completely or emerges as something far more powerful than anyone anticipated. The universe has been conducting this experiment for millennia, and today you're about to discover which category you belong to. The signs have been building around you, patterns so obvious that you'll wonder how you missed them. Your enemies made one fatal miscalculation when they declared war on you. They forgot they weren't just fighting a person, they were fighting destiny itself. This is the story of how their greatest weapon became your greatest victory. Like a house built on sand watching a tsunami approach, their entire conspiracy was doomed from the moment they chose you as their target. The mastermind behind your persecution wore the mask of someone who once claimed to love you. They didn't just leave your life gracefully. They departed like a general retreating from battle, but instead of admitting defeat, they decided to burn down the entire kingdom. What started as personal hurt transformed into something far more sinister, a systematic campaign of character assassination orchestrated with the precision of a military operation. They understood psychology better than most therapists. Every conversation they had about you was carefully crafted to plant seeds of doubt in fertile minds. They knew exactly which insecurities to target in your mutual friends, which fears to amplify in your family members, which prejudices to exploit in your community. They turned your kindness into evidence of manipulation, your success into proof of deception, your authenticity into a mask hiding something dark. But here's what they never understood about chosen ones. When someone with a pure heart becomes the target of such concentrated malice, the universe itself takes notice. Every lie they told about you created a debt that would eventually come due. Every person they turned against you became an unwitting participant in their own spiritual bankruptcy. They thought they were playing chess while you were playing checkers. In reality, they were playing with forces that operate by rules they could never comprehend. This person had always struggled with money, relationships, and self-control. These weren't character flaws, they were fundamental weaknesses that would become their undoing. But in their arrogance, they believed their silver tongue could manipulate reality itself. They were about to learn that reality has a way of collecting on every false word spoken with malicious intent. The speed at which your community turned against you should have been your first clue that something larger was at play. Friends who had known you for years suddenly viewed every interaction through a lens of suspicion. Neighbors who had shared holiday greetings began crossing the street to avoid you. Family members who had celebrated your achievements started questioning your motives. This wasn't natural human behavior. This was coordinated manipulation, exploiting the deepest psychological vulnerabilities of group dynamics. They had identified the perfect storm of community insecurities, economic anxieties, and social hierarchies that could be weaponized against you. They presented you as a threat to everything these people held dear, not through violence or obvious wrongdoing, but through the simple act of being authentically yourself in a world that rewards conformity. The conspiracy grew like a cancer, spreading through social networks, workplace relationships, and family connections. Each person who joined the campaign against you felt justified because they weren't acting alone. They were part of something larger, something that felt righteous and necessary. They called it concern. They called it intervention. They called it protecting the community from a dangerous individual. What they were really doing was participating in one of humanity's oldest and most shameful traditions, the systematic persecution of those who dare to shine their light in a world that prefers darkness. They couldn't attack your actions, so they attacked your character. They couldn't discredit your truth, so they discredited your sanity. They couldn't diminish your impact, so they tried to erase your existence entirely. But there was something else happening beneath the surface that none of them understood. As their traditional psychological warfare escalated and failed to break you, some members of this conspiracy descended into increasingly desperate measures. They began experimenting with surveillance techniques that crossed every legal and ethical boundary imaginable. Hidden cameras appeared in places they had no right to be. Your phone conversations were monitored and recorded. Your private correspondence was intercepted and analyzed for ammunition to use against you. The scope of their illegal surveillance operation was staggering. They had turned your entire life into a laboratory for psychological torture, documenting every method they used to break your spirit. They kept meticulous records of their experiments, believing their thoroughness made them scientific rather than criminal. These weren't random acts of spite. This was systematic psychological warfare conducted by people who genuinely believed they were studying how to destroy someone's sanity while maintaining plausible deniability. The surveillance network included corrupt law enforcement officers who had sworn oaths to protect and serve, but instead became foot soldiers in a campaign of psychological terrorism. They filed false reports, ignored your legitimate complaints, and actively participated in harassment that was slowly destroying your ability to function in your own community. The badge that should have represented justice had become a weapon of oppression, wielded by people who had abandoned every principle they once claimed to uphold. The rabbit hole went deeper still, and what you discovered would shake your understanding of how evil can hide behind respectable facades. Some members of this network were involved in activities so depraved that even hardened investigators struggled to process the evidence. Child exploitation rings operating under the cover of community organizations, human trafficking disguised as social services, the systematic abuse of the most vulnerable members of society, all coordinated by people who presented themselves as pillars of the community. Your case had inadvertently exposed a web of corruption that stretched far beyond personal revenge. You had become the crack in their foundation that brought down an entire structure of organized depravity. The people who thought they were destroying one inconvenient truth-teller had instead triggered the exposure of their entire criminal operation. In their arrogance and overconfidence, they had brought down the very network they had been trying to protect. But chosen ones aren't chosen because they're perfect. They're chosen because they can withstand the fire that would destroy ordinary souls. Every attack against you was simultaneously strengthening your spiritual armor and weakening theirs. They were pouring their life force into a battle they had already lost before it began. Your pure heart had acted like a beacon, drawing the attention of forces that would not tolerate such darkness to continue operating unchallenged. The most devastating revelation came when you discovered that your own family had been recruited into this campaign of destruction. Not all of them, but enough to make you question everything you thought you knew about blood loyalty and unconditional love. These weren't strangers operating from ignorance. These were people who knew your heart, your history, your struggles, and your triumphs, yet they chose to believe the worst possible interpretation of every situation. Some were step-family members who had never fully accepted you as one of their own. Others were relatives who saw an opportunity to finally rid themselves of the family member who made them uncomfortable with their authenticity. But the most heartbreaking were those connected to you by birth, who traded your well-being for acceptance into the conspiracy. They had been feeding information to your tormentors for months, maybe years. Your vulnerabilities, your fears, your private moments of doubt, all weaponized against you by the very people who should have been your safe harbor. The depth of their betrayal became apparent when you realized they weren't just passive participants. They were active conspirators, sharing your childhood traumas, your medical information, your financial struggles, and your relationship patterns with people who had no business knowing such intimate details. They violated every boundary that should have protected family confidentiality, turning your most vulnerable moments into ammunition for psychological warfare. Some of these family members had been promised rewards for their participation. Others were motivated by long-standing jealousies that had finally found an outlet. A few genuinely believed they were helping you by participating in what they were told was an intervention. But the majority knew exactly what they were doing and chose temporary social acceptance over permanent family bonds. The betrayal cut deeper than any stranger's cruelty could have, because it came wrapped in familiar voices that had once sung you lullabies and celebrated your birthdays. They knew exactly which words would hurt the most because they had been present for every wound that shaped you. They used your childhood traumas against you. They twisted your greatest achievements into evidence of character flaws. They made you doubt not just their love, but your own worth. But here's what they never understood about chosen ones and the cosmic laws that govern spiritual warfare. When earthly family abandons their chosen one, they don't just lose a family member. They sever their connection to the divine protection that had been covering them through their association with you. Every family member who participated in your persecution experienced an immediate shift in their luck, their health, their relationships, and their spiritual protection. The consequences weren't immediate enough for them to connect cause and effect, but they were consistent enough that the universe's message became unmistakable. Divorces that had been stable for decades suddenly erupted into bitter warfare. Health problems that had been manageable became serious medical crises. Financial stability that had seemed secure crumbled without warning. Children who had been respectful became rebellious and distant. They had traded their protection for the temporary satisfaction of participating in mob justice, never realizing that your pure heart had been a shield protecting everyone connected to you. When they chose to attack that heart instead of defending it, they exposed themselves to every form of spiritual consequence they had been unknowingly protected from. Yet even in this darkest hour, the universe was orchestrating something beautiful. When earthly family fails, spiritual family emerges. When human protection is withdrawn, divine protection intensifies. Your abandonment wasn't punishment, it was preparation for connections that would prove deeper and more loyal than anything based on shared genetics or legal obligations. The spiritual family that began gathering around you understood what your blood family never could. They recognized your light because they carried their own. They had survived their own persecution and understood the sacred responsibility of protecting other chosen ones who were under attack. They became your armor when your biological armor had been stripped away. Some of your tormentors weren't content with psychological warfare alone. They had to get creative. They had to dabble in forces they didn't understand, attempting to use spiritual attacks against someone whose spirit was shielded by something far greater than their collective malice. Night after night, they focused their hatred in your direction. They channeled their jealousy, their rage, their desperate need to see you destroyed. They gathered in secret circles, lighting candles with your name carved into the wax. They performed mirror rituals designed to trap your spirit and break your will. They used visualization techniques to send negativity directly to your energy field. They were so confident these methods would work because they had the numbers, the coordination, and the unified malicious intent. What could one pure heart do against such focused darkness? Everything, as it turned out. The Obsidian Inner Order is where you can process difficult realizations together every week on our Zoom calls with people who understand that some of life's most painful experiences become our greatest teachers. We don't encourage bitterness, we cultivate wisdom. Your ability to see people's true character is a gift that will protect you from future betrayals. Your willingness to forgive while maintaining boundaries shows strength, not weakness. Your wisdom was earned through experience, not given freely. Connect with people who value truth. Join the Obsidian Inner Order. Link in the description. Wadi te, pra people pizzles the topitha, top of the pows, what it a top of the pows, 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 top of the negative energy they sent your way hit your natural spiritual defenses like arrows striking armor, bouncing back to them, amplified by the very purity they were trying to destroy. Every mirror they used to send darkness reflected their own twisted nature back at them tenfold. Every candle they lit with malicious intent became a beacon illuminating their own spiritual bankruptcy. But there was something they never understood about working with mirrors and fire when your target is protected by divine forces. Mirrors reflect truth, and when someone with a pure heart looks into a mirror, all they see is love looking back. When someone with a twisted heart performs mirror magic on the pure-hearted, all they accomplish is showing themselves exactly what they've become. Every ritual they performed to curse you instead cursed them. Every mirror they used to send negativity your way reflected their own darkness back at them with compound interest. The candle magic was even more devastating to their spiritual protection. Fire is a purifying element, and when used with malicious intent against someone protected by divine forces, it burns away the practitioner's own psychic defenses. They were systematically destroying their own spiritual armor while strengthening yours. Each ritual made them more vulnerable to the very forces they were trying to command and less capable of protecting themselves from the consequences of their actions. The effects on them were immediate and terrifying. Insomnia struck first, followed by paranoia and the growing madness that comes from having your own malice reflected back at you, multiplied. They began seeing things, hearing whispers in empty rooms, experiencing phenomena that transformed skeptics into believers and believers into terrified children, hiding under blankets. Wanda Plight, this person, the silver-tongued orchestrator of this entire campaign, was hit the hardest. They became obsessed with you in ways that were both pathetic and frightening, unable to leave the past alone because the past was now actively hunting them. They knew that facing you would mean confronting the full magnitude of what they had done, and that confrontation would destroy whatever remained of their carefully constructed false identity. The spiritual consequences weren't limited to supernatural experiences. Their physical world began reflecting their spiritual bankruptcy. Relationships that had seemed solid crumbled without explanation. Financial opportunities that should have been certain disappeared at the last moment. Health issues that had been manageable became serious medical emergencies. Every area of their life began manifesting the chaos and destruction they had tried to send your way. They couldn't understand why their tried and tested methods of spiritual manipulation were not only failing but turning against them with such devastating precision. They had used these techniques successfully against other victims in the past. What they never realized was that those previous targets hadn't been chosen ones protected by forces far beyond their understanding or ability to manipulate. As traditional attacks failed more spectacularly with each attempt, the investigation into their activities uncovered something far more sinister than personal revenge. Your case had inadvertently exposed a network of criminal activity that stretched back years and involved multiple victims. The signature forgery that had been perpetrated against you wasn't an isolated incident of spite. It was part of a systematic operation involving sophisticated identity theft, financial fraud, and document manipulation. This person had been living a double life, presenting themselves as a struggling victim while operating as a practiced criminal. They had forged signatures on legal documents, insurance claims, and financial instruments with disturbing ease. They had stolen identities, opened accounts in other people's names, and systematically defrauded victims who never even knew they had been targeted. The operation was so extensive that investigators began to suspect professional training in criminal methodology. But the forgery involving you was different. It was personal. It was designed not just to steal from you, but to destroy you completely. They had forged your name on documents that would have ruined your credit, devastated your reputation, and left you financially destroyed. The level of malice required to systematically dismantle someone's entire life spoke to a pathological obsession that went far beyond normal criminal motivation. The universe's sense of justice became apparent in how they were caught. While they had been meticulous with their other victims, covering tracks with professional precision, their emotional investment in your destruction had made them careless. They left evidence trails they would never have left with strangers. Their personal vendetta became the loose thread that unraveled their entire criminal operation. The false reports they had filed began contradicting each other as investigators dug deeper. All those fabricated complaints and manufactured evidence formed a pattern so obvious that even corrupt officials couldn't ignore it indefinitely. The story that seemed solid when told by a unified group of conspirators suddenly had inconsistencies large enough to drive investigations through. As the legal walls closed in around them, they made their most desperate and pathetic move yet. They fabricated a child situation, claiming unexpected parenthood responsibilities, hoping to guilt you into reconciliation, generate public sympathy, and create legal complications that might delay the investigation. This wasn't just another lie. It was a calculated manipulation designed to accomplish multiple goals simultaneously while revealing the true depths of their moral bankruptcy. The universe has a way of exposing lies told with malicious intent. Documentation didn't add up. Stories became more inconsistent with each telling. The complete absence of evidence to support their claims became impossible to ignore. Even their closest allies began questioning this particular deception, sensing they had crossed a line from manipulation into outright fraud. The false child claim became the moment when even their most loyal supporters began abandoning them. There's something uniquely disturbing about someone who would fabricate potential parenthood to manipulate their victim. It revealed a level of emotional sickness that made even hardened criminals uncomfortable. The criminal network that had seemed so solid began fracturing under the weight of returned malice and cosmic justice. Suspicion crept through their ranks like poison. The unity they had used as a weapon against you dissolved as each faction tried to save itself by sacrificing the others. They started turning on each other with the same viciousness they had once directed at you. Your tormentors discovered they weren't just dealing with human law enforcement, they were confronting supernatural intervention that made no distinction between ringleaders and followers. Your ancestors, those who had fought their own battles and earned their place in the eternal realm, had taken notice of what was being done to their descendant. The haunting began subtly with dreams that felt more real than waking life, shadows moving independently, and whispers in empty rooms. The ancestral protection manifested in ways that defied rational explanation but followed spiritual laws older than civilization itself. Ancient warriors who had died defending their families recognized a kindred spirit under attack and responded with supernatural vengeance that modern minds couldn't comprehend or defend against. These weren't random ghostly encounters. This was organized spiritual warfare conducted by souls who understood justice in its purest form. Tompers and Pedley Compers, your persecutors found themselves trapped in experiences that felt like horror movies, but followed them into their waking hours. Objects moved without explanation. Electronics malfunctioned in impossible ways. Temperatures dropped dramatically in their presence, creating cold spots that lingered long after they left. Photographs of them began showing mysterious figures standing behind them, figures that hadn't been visible when the pictures were taken. The psychological impact was devastating because these were people who had built their lives on controlling narratives and manipulating perceptions. Suddenly they were experiencing phenomena that couldn't be explained, controlled, or dismissed. Their materialist worldview crumbled under the weight of supernatural evidence that refused to be rationalized away. Some tried to fight back using the same spiritual techniques they had used against you, but their efforts only intensified the ancestral response. They were children playing with forces that had been protecting chosen bloodlines for millennia. Every attempt to banish or bind these protective spirits only proved how little they understood about the powers they had awakened through their persecution of you. The very people who had mocked your spirituality and called your intuition delusion were now being forced to confront forces beyond their understanding. These forces showed no mercy to those who had shown no mercy to you. The leader of your persecution, who had never learned to manage money, emotions, or consequences, began unraveling completely under supernatural pressure that their materialist worldview couldn't explain or defend against. Their carefully constructed facade cracked as they realized their tried and tested methods of destruction were not only failing, but turning against them with compound interest. They couldn't understand why their coordinated attack had become their coordinated suicide. Every lie they had told was being exposed, every crime they had committed was being investigated, every spiritual attack they had launched was rebounding with multiplied force. The exposure came in waves, each more devastating than the last. First came the obvious criminal charges. The forged documents, false police reports, and financial crimes created paper trails that couldn't be ignored indefinitely. That master manipulator faced real consequences for the first time in their adult life. But the investigation couldn't stop there because criminal conspiracies are like houses of cards. Disturb one element and the entire structure collapses. The authorities who had been complicit found themselves under scrutiny. Community members who had participated in harassment campaigns found themselves answering uncomfortable questions. The secret network that had seemed so powerful discovered that their secrecy was simultaneously their greatest strength and ultimate weakness. When their activities were finally exposed to light, they couldn't hide behind collective influence anymore. Each member stood alone, accountable for their individual choices to participate in something that had revealed itself to be genuinely evil. The documentation they had kept of their psychological experiment, all those meticulous records that had made them feel so professional and justified, now stood as evidence in their own prosecution. The universe's sense of humor became apparent as what they thought was their victory parade revealed itself to be their funeral march. What they believed was their coordinated attack turned out to be their coordinated self-destruction. They had spent so much time and energy focused on destroying you that they had forgotten to protect themselves from the very forces they were attempting to weaponize. When those spiritual attacks rebounded, when the negative energy they had launched returned multiplied, they found themselves completely unprepared for the devastation. The fabricated child situation, the desperate attempts to maintain relevance, the increasingly erratic behavior, all resulted from someone who couldn't accept that their campaign of destruction had failed so spectacularly that it had destroyed them instead. The projection was so complete it would have been poetic if it weren't so devastating. They were the ones who couldn't handle reality. They were the ones living in delusion. They were the ones who couldn't accept responsibility for their actions. Every accusation they had made against you was a confession of their own sins, reflected back at them through the mirror of cosmic justice. This is when you begin to understand why you were chosen. Not because you're perfect, but because you're pure. Not because you're invulnerable, but because you're willing to remain authentic in a world that punishes authenticity. Not because you're wise, but because you're willing to speak truth, even when it appears to be madness. Your destiny wasn't just to survive their attacks, it was to expose them, to be the light that revealed their darkness, to be the catalyst that brought justice to those who thought they were above human law and divine justice, to be the living proof that no conspiracy, regardless of how vast or well coordinated, can ultimately triumph over truth backed by universal forces. They had tried to break you, but instead they had forged you into something stronger. Every attack had increased your resilience. Every lie had made your truth more apparent. Every attempt to isolate you had connected you more deeply to the divine forces protecting you. Every betrayal had cleared space for more authentic relationships to emerge. As their world crumbled and yours began rebuilding, you could see the bigger picture. This wasn't just about your personal vindication. It was about everyone who had ever been targeted by such conspiracies. Everyone who had been gaslit, harassed or abused by those in positions of power. Everyone who had been told they were crazy for speaking truth that made others uncomfortable. The most beautiful aspect of this cosmic justice was that they had orchestrated their own downfall through their own choices. You hadn't plotted revenge or planned their destruction. You had simply remained true to your essential nature, and the universe had handled the rest with precision that human planning could never achieve. The silver-tongued manipulator found themselves tongue-tied when confronted with the undeniable truth of their actions. The one who had never learned to manage money faced financial ruin. The one who had always played mind games discovered their own mind turning against them with the same viciousness they had directed outward. The community that had turned against you found themselves having to confront the reality of their participation in something genuinely evil. Some felt authentic shame and sought to make amends. Others retreated into denial, unable to face the magnitude of their mistakes. But all of them had to live with the knowledge that they had been part of something that would stain their conscience forever. The authorities who had been complicit found themselves under investigation by their own departments. The secret society that had seemed so powerful found themselves exposed and vulnerable to scrutiny they had never imagined possible. The network that had appeared so solid dissolved into chaos and mutual recrimination. And you, chosen one, emerged from this crucible refined like gold, not unscathed, because no one could endure such systematic persecution and remain unmarked, but stronger, wiser, and more deeply connected to your purpose than ever before. Being chosen doesn't mean being protected from suffering. It means being equipped to transform suffering into wisdom, pain into purpose, and persecution into power. You learn that your pure heart isn't a weakness to be exploited, but a strength that can withstand any attack. You discovered that truth doesn't need an army to defend it, just one person willing to speak it, regardless of consequences. You realized that the universe doesn't abandon its chosen ones, but sometimes takes longer than anticipated to reveal its protection and plan. The people who tried to destroy you had inadvertently prepared you for your true calling. They had tested your resolve, integrity, and capacity for love in the face of concentrated hate. You had passed every test, not because you were perfect, but because you refused to abandon your essential nature under pressure that would have broken most people. Now you understand the deeper truth about why this persecution was necessary for your evolution. Every chosen one must walk through the fire of mass rejection to develop the spiritual immunity needed for their mission. You couldn't fulfill your destiny while still believing that human approval was necessary for your worth. You couldn't step into your power while still depending on others to validate your truth. You couldn't become who you were meant to be while surrounded by people who were invested in keeping you small. The whole town working against you wasn't your punishment. It was your graduation ceremony from the ordinary world. Every person who turned against you was unknowingly participating in a cosmic initiation that would burn away everything false about your identity and reveal the indestructible essence underneath. They thought they were destroying you, but they were actually completing you. It takes extraordinary persecution to forge extraordinary power. It takes massive betrayal to develop unshakable self-trust. It takes complete isolation to discover that you were never actually alone. Your persecution wasn't random cruelty. It was precise preparation for a role that requires someone who cannot be bought, broken, intimidated, or corrupted by any human force. Someone who has already survived the worst that collective human malice can inflict and emerged with their love intact. Someone whose loyalty belongs entirely to truth rather than tribe. So here you stand in the ruins of their conspiracy, watching as justice arrives in forms more complete and perfectly calibrated than anything human courts could have devised. They thought they were writing your story, casting themselves as the authors of your destruction, but they were merely characters in a much larger narrative about good triumphing over evil, truth conquering lies, and love ultimately defeating hate. The whole damn town had worked together against little old you, and in the end that's exactly what it took to reveal their true nature, while showcasing the power of a single chosen one, backed by universal forces, because sometimes the universe needs a whole town of villains to properly demonstrate what authentic spiritual power looks like when it refuses to be broken. Your story isn't ending. If anything, it's just beginning. Because now you know who you really are, what you're truly capable of, and what you're really here to accomplish. You're not just a survivor of their coordinated attack. You're a warrior of light who has been tested in the fire and emerged purified, strengthened, and ready to fulfill the destiny that made them so desperate to destroy you in the first place. The chosen ones always win in the end. Not through violence or manipulation, but through the simple act of remaining authentic in a world that rewards deception, speaking truth in environments that prefer lies, and loving in the face of concentrated hate. This is your victory, and it was written in the stars long before your enemies made their first move against you.